Hello, everyone, and welcome to Resistance Live for the 16th of October, 2024. We're down to 20 days between now and the 2024 election, which is insane. We have a lot to talk about today, particularly the issue of whether or not Donald Trump's incredibly obvious decline and dementia is leading us in the direction of President Vance. If that doesn't scare you, I don't know what does. But we're going to talk about that this morning. And we got a lot more to talk about, including great developments out of Georgia, an incredible debate in Texas last night, and some breaking news out of Nebraska that could completely shake up the U.S. Senate. All right. So, yes, and I have to say this also, early voting starts today in Tennessee. Vote for Gloria Johnson. Vote for Gloria Johnson. Send Marsha Blackburn home. Okay. First things first, today for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a cream and black striped sweater. My hair is down. I'm a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman. I am in my office in front of an oak cabinet and my plant and a standing stack of books, including my own. I am coming to you, as always, from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohican land. And I am a dirty, blonde-haired, yes, pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman. Thank you. Okay, so let's just talk for a second about what's going on the Republican side of the ticket, because we discussed this here on this broadcast about 3 or 4 months ago when JD Vance was first announced, and when there started to be like an enormous amount of concern about how unqualified he was for the role and how he ended up on the ticket. Okay, so one of the things that we talked about at the time was JD Vance being very, very deep in with the Broligarchs, okay, with Peter Thiel, with Mark Anderson, having been funded in his work in the finance arena by some very scary far right-wing billionaires, all right? And those folks are the folks who seemingly got JD Vance on the ticket, all right? Now, one of the things that you would want if you were someone who, let's just say, had a far right-wing fascist agenda, would be a president who you could easily control, okay? And one of the things that we know about JD Vance is that he's an utter chameleon. Frankly, I have said this before, and it's worth saying again, he's a sociopath, all right? You see that in so many of his statements, in the way in which he has modified the things that come out of his mouth dramatically over the last 2 years, since he was running for Senate versus now. In the context of how he talks about things like Donald Trump and how he talks about things like immigration and how he talks about things like abortion rights. One of the things that's very obvious about him is that he doesn't have any problem changing what he has to say as long as it gets him power. Okay, that makes him a very, very dangerous man. And those of you who are here in August and back when he was first announced in advance of the RNC in July, know that I have been deeply concerned about him as a vice presidential nominee from the very beginning for exactly these reasons. All right. Now, one of the things that I will just say is that if you are one of those Broligarchs with a far right fascist agenda, in addition to wanting a president that you could control, you would also have very clear access at this moment and, frankly, over the last couple of years to Donald Trump. And one of the things that you might know, if you were kind of like intimately familiar with Donald Trump, let's say taking meetings with him routinely at Mar-a-Lago, is that you would have had a front row seat to his decline in private. All right. You would know already by the time we were approaching the RNC in the summer that something was deeply, deeply wrong with Donald Trump. And I'm not talking about what we knew was already deeply wrong with him, like his malignant narcissism, right? His willingness to kind of like throw anybody under the bus. The fact that he like basically tried to get his prior vice president killed. None of this would be a surprise to you. But what might be a surprise to you is his incredibly rapid mental decline. And if you wanted a means of seizing power, what you would seek to do in that event would be to install someone into the vice presidential slot who you knew would carry forward your agenda. By the way, this is also something you would do if you were someone from, let's just say hypothetically, the authorship team of Project 2025 or the Heritage Foundation, or for that matter, the Federalist Society and their like long quest to influence the Supreme Court. You would want to make sure that the second in command of that ticket, knowing that the first in command of your ticket with his huge cult following and his enormous backing, was not likely to make it through a second term. You would want to make sure that whoever was in that vice presidential slot was someone who would be willing to carry out the most abhorrent fascist policies that you and your little friends could imagine. So one of the things that I want people to think about here is that we are now not necessarily running against Donald Trump, okay? Like, yes, he's at the top of the ticket. Yes, he's still going to be at the top of the ticket on November 5th. But fundamentally, if you are out there talking to people, and I hope you are, about all the reasons why they need to vote in this election and why they need to vote blue, I hope you're talking about the threat of a potential President Vance. Because with how we're looking at this right now, with everything that we've seen in the last, let's just say hypothetically 48 hours, but really honestly, the entirety of 2024, there is not a snowball's chance in hell that if Donald Trump is elected to the presidency of the United States, he will survive a second term or not be 25th Amendmented. In fact, it wouldn't be shocking at all to have him be removed under the 25th Amendment within weeks of being installed as the president. Okay. So one of the things that I need people to consider here is that you now have a new talking point, right? You can talk about the fact that JD Vance is in the pockets of the oligarch billionaires and their right-wing agenda. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend putting it that way because that's, that sounds kind of ideological, but find a way to talk about it, all right? You can talk about the fact that he is on the record multiple times in favor of a nationwide abortion ban. You can talk about the fact that he is all in on immigration detention camps, that he's the person who started the rabid lies about Springfield, Ohio, and has doubled down on them, even in the face of actual evidence that those statements were false, that the police reports that started all of it were false. Okay. You can go all in on the idea that he is the person who is here to carry out Project 2025. And I very much want people to consider thoroughly that what we have seen from Donald Trump in the last 2 days alone, and we're not done yet, okay, is that he is not capable of even carrying on a normal conversation any longer. And that means he will not be president, at least not for very long, if he actually wins. All right. Now, we know that there are things coming. Okay, we got a troll here I got to deal with. We're still on the last few days of the troll bell. I'll talk more about that later on. All right. So we've got a long way to go on this, okay, for the next 20 days. I do want to point out that, in addition to everything that happened at that insane rally that we talked about yesterday, where it was basically let's put on his greatest hits and watch him sway to the music for 39 minutes before he wanders off stage as if he doesn't even know where he is. He did an interview yesterday with Bloomberg News and the Economic Club of Chicago. If you have not seen this interview, now I'm not going to go tell you to go watch the whole thing, but I'm just going to tell you something. He could not even remotely answer any of the questions that were put to him. He was asked a question about whether or not Google should be broken up. And what he said, what he started talking about was the voter rolls in Virginia. He's not there any longer. He's gone. And I'm just going to say a couple of other things about this because I want everybody to just recognize where we're at. Okay. You all know that I've been saying here on this broadcast for an extremely long time that, and we talked about this yesterday as well, that Trump's rapid mental decline was going to be on display for all to see in the weeks leading up to November 5th. Okay. I know that the event on Sunday night, we talked about this yesterday, was extremely bizarre and weird. And for some of us, very difficult to watch. All right. There were events yesterday that were exactly the same. His team canceled a CNBC interview. That's friendly territory yesterday for him. He cannot do this anymore. He's done. All right. But I'm going to tell you all that one of the things I've been predicting was a kind of public event that was so far beyond the pale that no one could fundamentally deny his insanity. Now, Stephen Miller may be out there doing it, and Stephen Chung, his campaign manager, is out there just lying, like flat out lying, claiming that the interview yesterday at the Economic Club of Chicago was the best thing he'd ever seen. All right. They're going to lie, and they're going to gaslight, and they're going to claim that up is down and, the sky is green, and we can expect that. All right. But I'm going to tell you, we have not seen the bottom yet of what Donald Trump is going to do between now and November 5th. And I have to make it very, very, very clear to all of you that it is only downhill from here for Donald Trump. It is going to be a descent into madness that is already very painful to watch and will be even worse. Okay. And some of you are going to celebrate it, and that's fine. Okay. But I'm just going to tell you all that it's going to get very, very, very ugly between now and November 5th. And I want everybody to be aware of that. All right. That's if they even let him out in public any longer, because it's very clear that he is being contained. All right. Okay. Some really good news this morning out of Georgia. So yesterday was the beginning of early voting in Georgia, as we talked about on yesterday's broadcast. You ready? Are you sitting down? Listen up. On the first day of early voting in Georgia in 2020, the turnout was 136,000 people. Yesterday, on the first day of early voting in Georgia, the turnout was 328,000 people. Almost triple what it was in 2020. And the 2020 number broke the all-time record. Okay. This is pretty damn good. And I went and looked at the data this morning just because I was really curious. 55% of those voters are women. So, this is the other thing I'm going to say here. We talked about the early voting data in Pennsylvania. We talked about it in Michigan. We're seeing enormous turnout by women in the early voting windows in some of these swing states. And in addition to that, we're seeing huge numbers of Black women turning out to vote for Kamala Harris. We don't know who they voted for yet, but that's the assumption. All right. Because Black women, by the way, based on the kind of polls that we've seen, are at a bare minimum 90% for Harris. In some polls, they're 96 to 98%. All right. So this is really, really, really good. And, I have to say that I think the things that we are seeing at this moment should give us reason for hope. All right. The Georgia early voter turnout numbers, I'm going to keep watching these. You too can look at them, by the way, because they're posted daily on the Secretary of State's website for Georgia, are astonishing. And we should find that to be very, very, very positive. I know we have another troll. I can't wait until we're done with this thing and me having to scroll and find these terrible people who show up here to kind of talk smack. All right. Anyhow, I will get that person very shortly. All right. Listen up. We had another very big, this person's going to. We have another very big development this morning out of Nebraska. All right. Many of you know that there have been some very interesting things happening in Nebraska in this election cycle. Shout out to our viewers in Nebraska, because we have a bunch of you. There's been the Blue Dot campaign in Nebraska, by the way, if you're not aware of this. There's been this huge campaign to have lawn signs with blue dots on them to indicate people who are Democratic in this state, which is ordinarily perceived to be very, very red. And some of the things that are happening in Omaha in particular are very dramatically positive. In fact, they seem to indicate that there's a chance that the Nebraska Senate seat could swing blue. All right, so buckle up, because there's some incredible news out of Nebraska this morning. The Nebraska Supreme Court today ordered the Secretary of State of Nebraska to immediately implement a new law that allows convicted felons who have served their time to vote in the state. Okay, why does this matter? Well, let me just tell you a couple things, okay? 1 in 4 Black men in this country have served time. And one of the reasons why there are laws on the books in a lot of these states to keep convicted felons from voting is because the vast majority of the convicted felons who have served their time who would vote are people who would vote Democratic. All right. So this particular development in Nebraska is a very big deal, because it means that anybody who has served their time in Nebraska can vote in this election. This could be the thing that swings that Nebraska Senate seat to blue. And I'm super excited about it. All right. So shout out to our Nebraska followers. You know who you are. I'm really stoked about this development. Okay. Somebody asked a question about this Supreme Court decision that came down about Pennsylvania's gun laws. All right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not directly relevant to the election. Obviously, gun violence is on the ballot this year. You all know that. We have one candidate who's in favor of the assault weapons ban and another one who just wants everybody to walk around with a gun. But in Pennsylvania, there is a gun law that is a fairly expansive gun law from 1995 that allows concealed carry permits for 21 and up. And there was an effort by like far right-wing forces to expand that law, wait for it, to 18 to 20-year-olds. So that if you were 18 years old and you were a high school senior, you could be walking around with a gun in your back pocket as long as you had a concealed carry license. The Supreme Court this morning has said, we think you should reconsider that and has sent it back down to the lower courts. Now, this is not a case that was heard on the traditional docket, but it does bode very well at this point for where we're going to go in terms of, Pennsylvania's gun laws. Okay, so I'm feeling very good about that one. So, we had a follower on the Patreon field that asked about it. It has been sent back down to the Third Circuit, not the Fifth Circuit, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which governs, among others, the federal courts in the state of Pennsylvania. Okay. Colin Allred debated Ted Cruz last night. Okay. If you want your moment of joy this morning, please go seek out the clips of Colin Allred just absolutely shattering Ted Cruz in this debate. It was an incredible debate for Colin Allred. I mean, just like absolutely incredible. He was so well prepared. He came armed with verbal ammunition about Ted Cruz hiding in a supply closet during January 6th when Colin Allred took off his jacket to defend the floor of the House. He talked about how Ted Cruz couldn't possibly be pro-law enforcement when, more than 100 police officers were beaten in the Capitol building on January 6th, and Ted Cruz still voted not to certify the election. He went to town on Ted Cruz, to the point that Ted Cruz at the beginning of the debate, was kind of yelly and not handling himself very well. There were moments in the middle of this when Colin Allred was really smacking him down, where all Ted Cruz could do was shake his head and smirk. And then even then he ended up staring down at his podium a fair amount. So I'm going to tell you that race is neck and neck. There are some polls that are showing Colin Allred is up by a point, definitely within the margin of error. Other polls that are showing that it's tied. So I'm just going to say this. I think that Colin Allred stands a chance, and I'm just going to call it, we talked about this before, flipping that Senate seat from red to blue and sending Ted Cruz home is on my, the highest levels of my wish list in this election. All right. So go find those clips. It was very solid. I think for people who maybe were not familiar with Colin Allred, who watched that in Texas, they may have kind of come to a different conclusion about what's possible in this Senate race. And I think it's very, very, very good. Okay. It's fun to watch also. Let me just say that. Okay. Speaking of polling, I have to talk this morning about some news that has sort of developed over the last 24 hours about the polls that are out right now. And we spent a lot of time here talking about how polling is unreliable and how the way in which polling is conducted is something that should be, seriously considered when you're considering whether or not a poll is valid or legitimate. We talked a lot about ignoring the polls and just keeping your nose to the grindstone and getting out the vote. But there's new news now about some of the polls that have come out in the last week that seems to indicate that there is a push from the GOP to fund GOP pollsters. By the way, if you didn't know this, there are certain polling companies that are directly affiliated with the Republican Party to pay for polls by Republican pollsters that make it look like Trump is overperforming. Why would they do this? Well, let me give you one kind of very clear reason. If there are polls circulating out there, even ones that are sort of seeded and not legitimate, that show that Trump is tied with Kamala Harris or beating Kamala Harris by a couple of points, when he loses the general election, he will use those polls as a basis to claim that the election was stolen or that there was election fraud. All right. So the attempt to try to overturn the 2024 election is already underway. This is one of the ways in which they are doing it. Okay. They are claiming that there are these polls that are legitimately conducted, that are unbiased, that show that Trump is winning. Okay. This is another reason why, by the way, why you should not like believe the polls. Just don't consider the polls. Just like set them to the side for the next 20 days. All right. This is a part of a long game setup to claim that the results of the 2024 election when Trump loses are not legitimate. See it for what it is. All right. And this, by the way, is something you should be talking about now. Like our job right now, in addition to getting out the vote everywhere that we live, with all of our friends and neighbors, with everyone that we encounter, making sure everyone knows how to vote, that they're actually voting and they're committing to voting blue up and down the ticket, has to be to tell people that Trump is already setting it up to claim that the election was stolen. And one of the ways that he's doing that is through polls. And another thing is by claiming that immigrants are registering en masse to vote when they don't have citizenship. Like all of this nonsense is a setup. It's a setup. Okay. The polls as well that are being conducted by GOP pollsters are a part of the setup. All right. Now we can have a long debate, and we probably will in the aftermath of this, about whether or not this constitutes a criminal conspiracy. I have some thoughts on that, and we'll talk about it on another day. But the key feature here now is that I want you all to remember that each of us has an obligation to educate people now that Trump is setting it up to make it look like he lost the election by fraud, and to not believe it. That like, we know this playbook. We've seen this before. When he lost in 2020 and he lost legitimately, he pulled out everything he could think of and threw it at the wall so that he could try to steal the election from all of the Americans who voted for Joe Biden. He's doing the same thing now with Kamala Harris. You know what this looks like. You know that this is all part of a scam, right? That's the language that we have to start using now so that people are prepared when he gets up and claims that it was stolen on November 6th or whenever the election is called for Kamala Harris, assuming we all do the work, all gas, no brakes. One of the things that we have to get ready for is that when he stands up and says that, everybody that we know has to be prepared with like, oh, here we go again with this stupid nonsense, right? That's the way that it needs to flow. People need to be prepared that he's going to do that and not be scared of it. Okay, so speaking of which, let's just talk about something that I put up in a thread this morning on Threads that's very important, okay? And it goes to the fact that we've talked about like many, many times here on this broadcast over the last few weeks, that there are a lot of people like me on YouTube, not women, who are out there right now trying to scare the living life out of you. I'm deleting my expletive because they want the clicks and they want the YouTube ad revenue by claiming that there's going to be mass violence after the election if Kamala Harris wins. Oh, I think we should all be prepared that there's going to be mass post-election violence. All right. So let me just go through a couple of things right now. Okay. Yes, we have to educate everybody that we know about the fact that Trump's going to claim that the election was stolen. We already know that. We can see it coming. All right. But in addition to that, I want to remind you of some things about this era in 2024 and this election cycle that are very, very different from where we were in 2020. Okay. In 2020, Trump was in control of the entire executive branch, the DOJ, the Department of Homeland Security, and all of their election protection mechanisms. Okay. The Attorney General's office. Because reminder, we had like all sorts of crazy stuff going on in the DOJ. Remember Bill Barr quit before January 6th? Remember that? He was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. Okay. And we had a vice president who was Donald Trump's vice president, who was ultimately in charge, thank the gods he didn't like fall for the ploy of certifying the Electoral College. All right. None of those things are true in 2024. Joe Biden is the president of the United States. He is the commander-in-chief of our U.S. military. The Department of Homeland Security is under the control of Alexander Mayorkas, and all of its cybersecurity protection mechanisms and election protection mechanisms are under the control of President Joe Biden. Okay. The FBI, which is a part of the DOJ, which is a part of the executive branch, is under the control of President Joe Biden. Okay. The National Guard is under the control of President Joe Biden. All right. In addition to that, Kamala Harris has hired Mark Elias, who many of you know from Democracy Docket, to head up the legal arm of protecting the election. There are 10 times as many lawyers working on the legal end of the Harris campaign right now as Joe Biden had in 2020. Okay. In addition, Kamala Harris is the current vice president of the United States. That means she also is the president of the Senate. She is ultimately the person who will certify the Electoral College. Now, do we have a problem potentially if we don't take back the House? Sort of. Okay. But I'm going to say this right now. This is yet another reason why you have to make sure that you are turning out the vote up and down the ballot and not just for Harris Walls, because we need the House. Could Mike Johnson make a little bit of a mess? Potentially. Do I think it would ultimately result in the election being overthrown? No. But I have to remind you all that all these pieces fit together. All right. And then on top of it, we have like a couple of really basic facts. Okay. Litigation is already ongoing in state and federal courts to protect the election itself. Okay, we talked yesterday about this great result out of Georgia, that the Georgia Board of Elections has a purely ministerial role. They have to certify the votes. They are not allowed to investigate or like insist on hand votes, hand ballot counts, and all sorts of other nonsense that they were trying to put into place, because that's not their job. All right. You want to know how that litigation began? Mark Elias. Okay. Just in the same way that we're seeing litigation out of all of these states with regard to how the election is going to be counted, who is certifying the electoral votes, how all of this is going to flow. Mark Elias has something like, the last time I heard about this, more than 60 pending cases right now that are election security cases. All of that is still ongoing. All right. So it's not like all of this is going to wait until after the election. It's already happening. Okay. And then on top of it, there's us. Okay, who are probably the most important component of election protection, by the way. Okay, because if we turn out the vote in a landslide, it will be absolutely impossible for Trump to succeed on any claim that the election was stolen. Okay, our numbers need to be huge because that's our part in making sure that the election sticks. All right, and all of these pieces are going to come together. All of them are going to work in conjunction. But the easiest way to making sure that the election is secure this year is to vote in such overwhelming numbers that anything that Donald Trump tries to do to mess with this cannot succeed, has to fail. Okay? Just imagine if Georgia flipped blue by 100,000 votes instead of 11,700 and some odd. Right? Find me 100,000 votes. That's impossible, right? So it's time to get very, very, very focused there's what's happening today, guys? There are these trolls that I banned who come back under different names. It's really obvious when this happens. So that is that. All right. Okay. I have to talk for a minute about the issue of Donald Trump's mental state vis-a-vis the trials that he is facing and his looming sentencing in New York. So everybody needs to understand something, okay? The trolls are cracking me up today, you guys. All right. I'm going to just say this, all right, because I want everybody to understand this. There is no means by which Trump's mental incompetence is going to impact his sentencing in New York, okay? The pretrial sentencing report has already been submitted. It is private. We will never see it. He completed his pre-sentencing interview with the probation department within a week of his conviction, all right? Plus, in order for anything to be considered that way in terms of a downward deviation from the appropriate sentence, his attorneys would have to argue that he is mentally incapacitated. Okay, or that he's got dementia, or that he's got some other medical condition that should require him to be incarcerated in a certain facility or not incarcerated at all. He is a malignant narcissist. He is never going to allow his attorneys to make that kind of argument in court at all. At all. Okay, so you don't need to worry about this. There's not going to be any argument or setup here that his sentence should be negated, which you can't do anyway. If he happens to be sentenced to prison, reminder, the sentencing guidelines for the fraudulent documents case in the context of where we are for every single one of the 34 counts is anything from probation to 4 years per count. My prediction has always been that we're going to get 4 years served consecutively. We'll see. There's not a chance in hell that anything that he is we're seeing in him right now is going to come out to play in that court of law at all. All right. There is no insanity defense to the claims that he is facing in any other prosecution. There's no insanity defense to keeping classified documents. There's no insanity defense to conspiracy to interfere with rights. Insanity defenses exist for murder. They don't exist for every single crime that you'll ever commit. Okay. Now, that's a different story from your capacity to stand trial. All right. So if hypothetically, one of his lawyers said, we have a concern about his mental capacity to participate in his own defense. All right. He would go through a robust psychological evaluation at the order of the court in which that argument was made. There would be a determination about whether or not he was capable of providing evidence to his lawyers and talking to them about what happened and, agreeing or not agreeing with certain arguments that they wanted to make, right? That would be the determination. But if he's found mentally incapable of standing trial, he doesn't get off. Like, this is the other thing I have to remind you all. He'll be incarcerated in a prison for the criminally insane or in like a mental institution until such time as he is fit to stand trial. All right. So nobody needs to worry about this, right? Like, he's not doing this in some version of 8D chess because he doesn't want to go to prison. He's running for president because he doesn't want to go to prison. All right. He's not pretending to be insane. And I'm going to say it again. There's not going to be any way at all that he is going to allow his lawyers to make any of these arguments in a court of law anyway. It's not going to happen. Okay. You all are giving him too much freaking credit if that's what you believe. Okay. A man who literally cannot answer a question, who is standing in front of a crowd for 39 minutes, swaying to Guns N' Roses and, like Rufus Wainwright and, Celine Dion. Okay. He is not someone who is making this up. Okay. He's not making it up. And simultaneously, because of his pathology, namely his like virulent, malignant narcissism, he will never allow a lawyer to admit any weakness. He will never allow it. All right. So stop worrying about it. Stop worrying about it. Okay. All right. Final question for today came off the Patreon feed. And then we have something else we have to talk about briefly, which was basically like, how do we speed up the judicial system? I mean, this is such a robust question that I don't really want to spend too much time on it today on the broadcast. Okay, we do have the right to a speedy trial in our Constitution. That means unless you waive that right, which you can waive, you're supposed to go to trial in what's considered to be like a speedy window of time. That's usually like 6 months. Okay, like I'm going to remind you all, by the way, there's a trial date that has been set already for P. Diddy in May. All right, like he's going to go to trial quickly on the criminal charges that have been levied against him in New York, for which he is in pretrial detention. And apparently in solitary confinement. So ordinarily in criminal and civil cases, there are some jurisdictions that are faster than others. You all know that the first federal court argument I did was in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is known as the rocket docket, because it moves cases along much faster than some other federal courts. A lot of this has to do with court resources. It has to do with the philosophies of the chief judge of a given court. Okay. And this is not something that can be like radically rectified overnight. Okay. I know some of you are like chomping at the bit to see Trump in prison, but this question came up in the context of me saying like, reminder, the US judicial system is not law and order. Okay. And I'm going to tell you something. You can't make it law and order. We can't make it law and order. Like there are certain due process considerations, like the exchange of discovery and deadlines for expert witnesses and requirements of like, what kind of pleas you're going to ask for in front of a jury, whether or not you're going to include lesser included offenses, whether or not you're going to make evidentiary motions that certain things should be excluded. These things take time. Okay. And the thing that we don't want is a judicial system that skips all of these steps, because that results in innocent people being put in prison, which we already, by the way, have a really massive problem with in this country. All right. So let's make sure that where we head to going forward when we think about things like judicial reform is that, I'm going to get rid of this woman. When we think about things like judicial reform is things that actually are grounded in the importance of justice, right? For everyone, not just for Donald Trump, like for the average everyday person who might be accused of a crime that they did not commit. Right? There's that saying that they teach you in law school and that many of you have heard before, which is that it would be better for 1,000 guilty men to go free than for one innocent person to end up in prison. And we're failing at that as a nation. All right. So the protection of all of this, right, depends on thoughtful, nuanced analysis in a Harris-Walz administration. And by the way, you want to fix your state level courts, you got to pay very close attention to who you are electing for statewide office and for judicial appointments, okay, for judicial positions, okay? Because all of this gets decided on a state and local level by the people who are in charge of your local judicial system, the judges that you put on the bench, who the chief judge is, who the attorney general of your state is, okay? Who you elect to your state legislatures. When I tell you every election matters, I mean it, okay? All right, final thing for today, for those of you who weren't watching yesterday, we are moving, starting Monday, to having only the live comment feed. Okay, I'm going to make this very, very clear because lots of you didn't understand this yesterday. Only the live comment feed during the live stream will be, we're moving to make sure that it is only available to people who are members of this YouTube channel who pay for that membership, all right? The reason for this is that I'm done blocking trolls. It's a pain in the butt. It's starting to get to the point where it's interfering with the broadcast. And as we scale, some days like today, we end up like getting swarmed and I'm distracted and I'm tired of it, okay? For somebody raised this yesterday, like, why didn't you make it subscribers only? It's already subscribers only. So like if you can subscribe to this YouTube channel for free, you should do that and give me a thumbs up, okay? You can't comment on the live stream right now if you're not already a subscriber to this channel. So those trolls are subscribing so they can comment, all right? Everybody understand? Starting Monday, if you want to be able to comment during the live stream only, comments below after the fact will still be free and open to all. We have strict moderation set up on that. Thank you, YouTube. But if you want to comment during the live stream, you've got to become a paid member of this channel. How do you do that? You click join below this video if you are watching it on a desktop or a laptop. If you're watching on iOS, it may look like a $sign, okay? And you may have to, if you're watching it on your phone, scroll up, head to my channel, and click join, all right? So you may have to hunt for it a little bit, but this is how it's going to be. If you are a paid member of this channel on YouTube, Patreon is different, on YouTube, you will still be able to comment live during the live stream. Otherwise, you're going to have to save your comments for below the stream after it's over, all right? And the reason for that is so that we don't get trolled nonstop while I'm live, because it's starting to drive some of you crazy. It's starting to drive me a little crazy, and it's meant to distract and throw me off. Now, I'm really good at this, former trial court lawyer. You know, you all know that I can think and read on my feet very well, all right? All that said, this is to protect this audience. It is to protect my staff, okay? And it's to make sure that as we scale, we have it all under control. And most political channels are doing this now, frankly, on live streams. So this is not unusual. And it is kind of like a protective mechanism to keep the channel and the community safe, all right? I get a slight cut of the fees. I do not get all of it, all right? And I will remind you all that Patreon will still stay where it is. If you want to ask me questions for the live stream, you need to join Patreon. You want to join Progressive Coffee Hour, you need to join Patreon, all right? That's where all the Patreon benefits, merch, everything else that you guys have become familiar with over the last 8 years will still live. This is just to make sure that the live stream is troll free. All right. And, you know, occasionally there may be somebody who's willing to kick me $5 to come on here and talk smack to me, and we'll deal with them if we need to, but I don't think it's going to happen much. All right. So that will be that. And for those of you who like to comment live and talk to each other live, this will be a means of doing that without having to scream troll every 5 seconds or block them yourself. All right. If you want to know whether or not you're a member, the names that are going by on the live stream in green that have those little badges next to them, those are our channel members. You will get your own badge. You will also get your own Resistance Live emoji if you join us there, and various other benefits. All right. But the broadcast will still be free. Subscribing to the channel is still free. Commenting below after the fact, still free. Okay. I'm still going to be here. All right. And we'll see you all here later on today if there's a need for an emergency broadcast, or tomorrow. All right. Keep your chins up, keep your get out the vote nose to the grindstone, and all gas, no brakes till November 5th. All right, my friends, it's looking good. I'm hopeful. All right, I'll catch you all here tomorrow. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.